You're listening to the weekly Parsha Podcast with Ari Goldwag, recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat B'Shem Israel 5778, 2018. This week's Parsha is Parsha's Balak, and Balak is always an exciting time for me because it's the completion of a cycle I started 11 years ago with the Parsha Podcasts, and this is my anniversary, 11 years, and in celebration of that, I'd like to invite you to my website, arigoldwag.com. Click on the Buy Now page, and on top you'll find a donate button. Help this podcast continue to exist by supporting it. I'd like to share with you some ideas about our Parsha, Parsha's Balak, and specifically about the persona of Bilam, of who he was, what he represents, and how we can learn from him, obviously how not to be, because he does not represent the greatest virtues that are found in the Torah, even though he does praise the Jewish people, but he does it against his own will. He is trying to curse the Jewish people. I'd like to point out a few different interesting points about Bilam. I'd like to try to understand what is the significance of these points and how can we learn from them. An interesting point, number one, we need to understand what this means. But our Chazal tell us, our sages say, that Bilam is the same person as Lavan. Notice they both have the letters Lamed and Beis in their name. Bilam, and Lavan. Okay, so they're the same person, which, as the Arizal explains, means that they have the same soul. They have the same soul root. Now, what is the idea that Lavan and Bilam? Laban was the guy who his daughters married Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, right? And he chased after Yaakov to try to prevent him from going back to the land of Israel. And he claimed that they had stolen his idols, right? That's Lavan. Bilam is the character in our story who tries to curse the Jewish people. What is the connection between these two people? What does it mean that they share the same soul root? Okay, that's question number one. Our sages also tell us something which is amazing, and that is that Bilam, in a certain sense, had a nevuah, had a prophecy or a level of prophecy that was greater than Moshe Rabbeinu, that was or on par with or greater than Moses. And the question is, what does that mean? Reb Chaim Friedlander speaks about it at length. He quotes the Ramban, and I'd like to share with you some of the ideas quoted there. But Bilam is referred to as Bilam HaKaisem, which means he was a magician. What could he do? He could perform magic. He could perform real magic, black magic. We're not talking about the sleight of hand which we see today, but the magic, the magicians, the Khartoumim of Mitzrayim, the Egyptian necromancers were able to perform true magic. And so is Bilam. So he was a magician. He was Bilam HaKaisem. And it seems, as Reb Chaim Friedlander says, that he started off as a Kaisem, as somebody who could see the future. He was able to read the future. Perhaps he could see it in the stars, whatever his methods were. But he wasn't more than just a simple magician, which of course was a great wisdom, a great chachma for that time. But the fact that he was able to get a nevuah, the fact that he was able to get a true prophecy that Hashem spoke through him, spoke to him, was a great chiddush, was a great novelty. So who was he? Was he a prophet? It seems, as our Chazal say, and Reb Chaim Friedlander quotes, that Bilam was somebody who Hashem said, look, the nations of the world, I don't want them to complain and say, look, the Jewish people, they have their great prophets. That's why they became so great. But we didn't have anybody great. We didn't have any prophets. So we are, it's not fair. It wasn't fair for us. We didn't have a chance. So they were provided with Bilam as a prophet for them, a Navi. But when we look at his quality as a prophet, as a Navi, his level is not so great, and it's such a short-lived amount of time that we wonder what was Hashem providing, so to speak, for the Ummah, for the nations of the world, in regards to responding to their issue, in regards to responding to their request for a chance as well. It doesn't seem like it's so much of a chance. Even Bilam himself, as Reb Chaim Friedlander speaks about it, he speaks about the fact that when we look at the difference between a Moshe Rabbeinu, we look at the difference between the way the Jewish people receive prophecy. In order to receive prophecy, so a person needed to be a highly developed human being. They needed to be somebody who was a high quality person. Moshe Rabbeinu was the Ana Mikol Adam. He had this amazing power. He had this amazing prophecy. God spoke to him one-on-one. And yet he remained humble. Not only did he remain humble, but he was perhaps one of the most humble people of all time. So when we look at Moshe and we look at Lahadu, we look at Bilam, he was the exact opposite. He was not a good person. He was just interested in the future. He had wisdom, but the nevuah, the prophecy, which he had for one small period of time, didn't change him, didn't affect him, didn't make him into a better person. If anything, the power corrupted him, as is the way power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Bilam used his power to as a weapon against the Jewish people, and he said, look, we can destroy them spiritually if we cause them to sin. And he created a very difficult situation for the Jewish people. But what is the idea? How are we to understand who is this prophet Bilam? What is his purpose? What is his role? How does he help the Umas Ha'olam? Or what is perhaps the parallel between Bilam and the Umas Ha'olam as opposed to Moshe Rabbeinu and the Jewish people? What is the difference between the Jewish people, Bigadol, right? Of course, there are going to be individuals who are an exception to every rule. There are going to be people within the Umas Ha'olam who are on a spiritual level which is, beyond them. And there are going to be people within the Jewish people who are on a spiritual level which is below the paradigm of who the Jewish people represent. We need to understand what is the paradigm, what is the essential nature of the Jewish people, of a Yid, of a Jew, versus the essential nature of someone who's considered Umas Ha'olam, the nations of the world. As represented by Bilam in this case, we need to understand that. Okay, and we also need to understand the difference, the contrast between a Bilam and Lahadu Moshe Rabbeinu, the Jewish people and the Umas Ha'olam. What is the specific nature of that, as well as how does that parallel, as we asked in the first question, how does that parallel what happened with Lavan? Laban was somebody who, as we said, soul parallels Bilam. How does that idea correlate with what we're speaking about in our context as well? So what I'd like to share with you is a very beautiful and deep thought that is applicable to each and every single one of us. We all have a little bit of Bilam inside of us, a little bit of Lavan inside of us, a little bit of Umas Ha'olam, nations of the world inside of us. And we all have parallel to that, or in the forces of reality, corresponding Zelu Mazeh, one corresponding to another. We have the power of Moshe Rabbeinu inside of us. We have the power of the Jewish people inside of us. We have the power of spirituality inside of us. What is the difference? And notice, it's very interesting. When we speak about Bilam is somebody who indeed says, I can't say anything unless God says it. If God says it, I can say it. Otherwise, I can't. He acknowledges that his power is limited. He acknowledges that there is a God. There's one God. And yet, he remains a kaisim. He remains a magician. Umas Ha'olam also, the nations of the world, also, they say, hey, what about us? We want an opportunity to have a relationship with God. You know, the famous story, Chazal tell us, which I've quoted a number of times, about in the future time when Mashiach, when the Messiah arrives, so the nations of the world will say, hey, what about us? You gave all these mitzvahs to the Jewish people. We didn't get any mitzvahs. We didn't get any commandments besides our Shiva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, the 7 Noachide commandments, but we didn't get anything. What about us? And God gives them the mitzvah of sukkah, and the result is that they walk out of the sukkah. It's too hot for them, and they kick the sukkah. So it's very interesting. In that story as well, we see that the character, and this is like the essential foundation of the idea I want to say, the character of the Umas Ha'olam and the character of a Lavan and the character of a Bilam, they experience a momentary inspiration. They experience, as Lavan is running after Yaakov Avinu, after Jacob, he knows through his nichush, interestingly, he knows through his magical ways, he's able to figure out that the wealth that he had was because of Jacob. So it's all because of Jacob. He recognizes that. He sees that. And Lavan is somebody who has, his daughters are Rivka and Leah are the forebears of the Jewish people. They are 2 of the 4 mothers of the Jewish people. And yet, Lavan, as he runs after the Jewish people, as he runs after Yaakov and his wives and the 12 grandsons of his, because they're going back to the land of Israel, as he runs after them, so the night before he meets them, he has a revelation as well. Just like Bilam has a revelation from God, Lavan has a revelation from God. And Hashem says to Lavan, don't touch them. Don't mess with them. Don't start up with them. And the next morning he comes and he doesn't precisely listen to Hashem. Hashem tells him, don't even talk to him. Not good and not bad. And Lavan comes and he meets with them. And he makes a pact with them Yaakov is going to stay on his side of the rock. Lavan and his people are going to stay on the other side of the rock. But Lavan has a spiritual experience for a moment because of his interaction with Yaakov, because of his interaction with the Jewish people. Bilam also, he has an awesome spiritual experience. As Reb Chaim Friedlander explains, why was he raised up to the level of Nevuah? He was raised up to the level of Nevuah only because the Jewish people were coming. Very interesting. The Jewish people, in both cases, both with Lavan and with Bilam, Yaakov and his wives and his children are heading back to the land of Israel. A certain aspect of return to the land of Israel is an aspect of redemption. Jewish people returning to Israel. Lavan tries to stop that. On the way to trying to stop that, Lavan experiences a godly experience, which is God says, don't start up with them. Bilam too is hired by Balak, the king of Moab. When? At which point? At the end of the 40 years of the Jewish people in the wilderness, as they're about to enter into the land of Israel. Right? So Bilam comes here as well. And Hashem says to him, don't mess with the Jewish people. Only say the words that I say to say. Don't say anything else. And so Bilam also has a spiritual experience. And I want to say that that's the character of the Umas Ha'olam. The character of the Umas Ha'olam is, when do they say, hey, we didn't get any mitzvahs, we didn't get any commandments in that story, in that mashal of Chazal. They say that when the Jewish people have experienced redemption, the Jewish people have returned to the land of Israel, and they're like, hey, we want a piece of this too. So it's very nice. It's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing that the Umas Ha'olam want a piece of the spirituality, relationship with God as well. But when do they wake up? And when does Bilam wake up? And when does Lavan wake up? They wake up when they see a massive explosion of spirituality, a massive explosion of awesomeness. That's when they wake up. And how long is that inspiration? How long does it last for them? It lasts a very short time. Bilam has that inspiration for a short moment. Before he was a magician, he has a moment of prophecy, and afterwards he's a magician. It doesn't last very long for him. And that's the difference between the way that the Umas Ha'olam, the nations of the world, experience spirituality, versus the way that the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu, experience spirituality. What's the difference? Now let's take a moment. We've been looking now at Bilam, we've been looking at Lavan. Now let's look at Moshe. Lahavdil. Let's look at Moshe, look at the Jewish people, and the way that we experience spirituality. Yes, in a certain sense, we also have that moment of inspiration. The Jewish people have just experienced an awesome, miraculous exodus from Egypt. Unbelievable thing. They came to Mount Sinai. But notice, and we see the story, we read the description of events the Torah teltells us, and we see this as well. The Jewish people, they had a fall, and therefore it was decreed on them that they would have to be 40 years in the Midbar. But we have to believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem plans everything from the beginning. Of course, there are options. We can choose different paths. Lamaisa and all, the Jewish people are there for 40 years in the Midbar. What are they doing for 40 years? The 40 years that they were in the Midbar, in the wilderness, they're called the Dor Deah. They were the generation of knowledge. They were the ones who received the Torah, and they were the ones who for 40 years were living the Torah, living, breathing Shechina. They were living inside of that spiritual realm every single day. And it wasn't just like a moment of inspiration, and then before they were nothing, moment of inspiration, now there's something, and then they lose it. It wasn't like that at all. It was the constant continuous, tamidi, every single day, getting up in the morning, praying in the afternoon, praying in the evening. Every single day, putting on the tefillin, putting on the talis. Every single day, learning the Torah, coming back. Every single day, living the life of Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu was somebody who he spent years working on himself, becoming a great person. He didn't all of a sudden receive the nevuah. It didn't come in a moment because, like Bilam. No, Moshe Rabbeinu was 80 years old when he had his first nevuah, when he had the first prophecy from Hashem that God spoke to him and said, go take the Jewish people out of Egypt. And then for the continuing 40 years after that, he was constantly working on himself. He's constantly making himself greater. But it was done in a concerted way, in a consistent way, in a way which wasn't like, wow, awesome inspiration. It was just like, hey, one action, another action, another action. And that's what led him to greatness. And that's what leads the Jewish people to greatness. The Jewish people, yes, of course, each and every one of us has inside of us both of these elements. We need the inspiration. We want to be inspired. When we see somebody else who's succeeding because of their spirituality, we also want spirituality. We also want to have access to that. Now, but that's Bilam. The Bilam and the Umas Ha'olam and Lavan, they have a moment of inspiration. It raises them up for a moment. They're interested for a moment, and then they just fall right back to where they were before. The characteristic of the Jewish people is we have a moment of inspiration, but when does it come? It comes after a lot of work. And that, as Reb Chaim Friedlander says, is the difference between a regular Navi, a prophet, a Moshe Rabbeinu, and Lahavdil, a Bilam. A Navi worked his entire life. He didn't know when the Nevuah was going to come. He didn't know when the prophecy was going to come, but he perfected himself. He worked on his midos. He worked on his character traits. He became a greater person through his consistent and constant efforts. One foot in front of the other. One action and another action and another action. And sometimes it's not exciting. It's not exciting to say the same exact prayer 3 times a day. To get to the synagogue 3 times a day. There's so many things that we do, and it feels like it's by rote, and we wonder, like, what is this about? What is the idea? But the idea is that it gives us a framework. It gives us a misgeres, that inside of this framework, when a person is consistent and takes these actions every single day, so then the result is that the spirituality that he receives is not just a fly by night, a moment of inspiration, like a Lavan who sees, wow, Hashem spoke to me, wow, a Bilam, wow, Hashem spoke through me. Before he's a magician, afterwards it's not like that. With Am Yisrael, with Klal Yisrael, we've been at this for 3,300 years. Hashem gave us the Torah 3,300 years ago. And by the way, this isn't something that's for everyone. That's why it's not so easy to convert to Judaism, and that's why we don't look for converts, because this is something that requires consistent effort. And that's not something that's for everyone. Most people need to be inspired, uplifted, and the inspiration just goes away, and the person is left exactly where they were before. The Torah is telling us here with the story of Bilam, and the Torah is telling us with the contrast between a Bilam and a Moshe, that this is the way. The way is through consistent effort. The way is through consistency, coming to learn the Torah. And another point that Reb Chaim Friedlander brings out is that the difference is that a Bilam, so he gets the inspiration, wow, but then it doesn't change him inside, right? And that's exactly what we're talking about here as well. The inspiration is meant to be incorporated. We get that moment of inspiration and we have this high and it's awesome. But now, when does it start to change us? That's only through the concerted effort, the consistent effort, and taking on things, taking on commitments as a result of the inspiration. That's how we continue to hold on to the inspiration and become the Moshe Rabbeinu. Of course, we're supposed to be who we are, each one of us. But Moshe is that example of somebody who consistently worked on himself, who instead of becoming an awesome, having this awesome power and becoming corrupted, he became a deeper and deeper anav, more and more humble. And so that was because he took the inspiration and he was mafnim, this or makif. That's how Reb Chaim Friedlander speaks about it from the Reb Chaim Volozhin. This or makif of inspiration, the light which surrounds us when we're getting ready to perform a mitzvah, to perform a commandment, to bring spirituality into ourselves, to draw that into ourselves and have it inside of us, and for it to expand within us instead of just being something that is fly by night, flows away. So that is the challenge, and that is what we're after. That's what we're trying to do here. So I want to bless you and ask you to please bless me back. Hashem should help us, that we should be zeich, we should merit, to be able to take the consistent action, to recognize the Bilam inside of us, which wants that moment of inspiration, which sees someone else accomplishing or having success, even whether it be spiritual or whether it be in ordinary matters. Hashem should help us to recognize that we need to take consistent action. Hashem should help us to be able to take that consistent action so that we develop spiritually, that the spiritual light which we experience isn't just something which flashes on and off and we're left the same, but rather it's something which we take the actions to allow to come inside of ourselves. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.